Began to empty out of the auditorium, a jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston. Began to empty out of the auditorium,
the Schomburg Center
a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and to
a
my
library,
amazement,
so much more
Amira
than that.
Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance.
So many amazing
and they started to
people come
dance
here
on
to
top
talk
of the
about their
cosmogram,
creative
on top of the
craft,
ashes
to
of
share
Langston Hughes,
and
and I
inspire.
felt what a fitting way to kiss the
Schomburg
memory
Center's
of Langston.
collections
Began to
help
empty out of the
tell
auditorium,
The Schomburg Center
a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and
and
to
a
my
library,
amazement,
so much more
Amira
than that.
Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou
Jacob
for a
Lawrence,
dance.
So many
and
amazing
they started to
people come
dance
here
on
depend
top
on
of
the
the
resources that
cosmogram,
are
on top of the ashes of
enable us to
Langston
tell
Hughes,
the story.
and I felt what a
Thinking
fitting
about the
way to kiss the
implications of
memory
the past,
Center's
once,
collections.
present,
Began to empty out of the
The
auditorium,
Schomburg Center
a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and to
and a
my
library, so
amazement,
much more
Amira
than that.
Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou
Jacob
for a
Lawrence,
dance.
So many
and
amazing
they started to
people
dance
come
on
here
top
to
of the
talk about their
cosmogram,
creative
on top of the
craft,
ashes
to
of
share
Langston
and
Hughes,
inspire.
and I felt what a
Thinking
fitting
about the
way to kiss the
implications of the
memory
past,
Center's
once,
collections.
present,
Began to empty out of the
The
auditorium,
Schomburg Center
a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou
Jacob
for a
Lawrence,
dance. and they started to dance on
depend
top
on
of
the
the
resources that
cosmogram,
are
on top of the ashes of
enable us to
Langston
tell the
Hughes,
story.
and I felt what a
Thinking
fitting
about the
way to kiss the
implications of the
memory
past, once, present,
began to empty out of the
The
auditorium,
Schomburg Center
a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou
Jacob
for a
Lawrence,
dance. and they started to dance on top of the cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a
thinking
fitting
about the
way to kiss the
implications of
memory
the past, once, present,
began to empty out of the
The Schomburg Center
auditorium, a jazz
is a
trio
research
struck up,
institute
and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou
Jacob
for a
Lawrence,
dance. and they started to dance on top of the cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory
Welcome, good evening. Sorry about that glitch, but now we're all here together, and it is so great to be here on this first day of Black History Month. But of course, as Schomburg always says, every month and every day is Black History Month. So this is our 11th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Study. Good evening. Sorry about that glitch, but now we're all here together, and it is so great to be here on this first day of Black History Month. But of course, as Schomburg always says, every month and every day is Black History Month. So this is our 11th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Study. Good evening. Sorry about that glitch, but now we're all here together, and it is so great to be here on this. Every month and every day is Black History Month. So this is our 11th. Good evening and welcome. Sorry, it's been a little bit chaotic, but thank you so much for sticking with us. Welcome to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. This is our 11th season, and I know from some of you in the chat that you are often with us, have been with us for many years, so thank you for joining us tonight. For people who are your first time, or if you've been here before, Kamosi Woodard and I started this series 11 years ago with the Schomburg to create a space where the public could engage with new works in Black history. With fewer and fewer public spaces, with bookstores closing, we wanted to create a space to hear, learn, discuss new work in Black history that in many ways helps us see the present and future more clearly. We are so pleased that the Schomburg Center has continued this series as one of its educational and public programming. We are grateful to Lucien Baskin, who is our outreach and social media coordinator. Please follow us at Schomburg CBFS and at our website, Black Freedom Studies. And our next conversation, we're going to be back in the building, so please come back to the building. We'll be talking about Black women, freedom making in the long 1960s, and Anastasia Kerwood, Suzanne Cope, Tamika Brown-Nagin, and Christina Green will be with us. So that is March 7th, Thursday, March 7th, because as all of you know, it's first Thursday of the month is Schomburg Conversations. Now on to you, Robin.
Welcome, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hanging in with us. This is going to be the conversation that made the glitch worth it. Okay. This is an urgent conversation as we consider freedom movements before Brown versus Board of Education. We're so delighted to be together online for this timely conversation at a new moment of political organizing and uprising, and of course, during Black History Month. That's been the goal of Conversations from the very beginning, from its inception 11 years ago. The idea that the history we need to see, the history we need to move forward, the history we need to see the past more clearly, can be brought to you in a community space where scholarly experts, where activists, where ordinary people can come together and talk about history. I'm delighted and honored to introduce tonight's panelists. Their books are available in the Schomburg shop online. And if you're in Harlem, please stop by the Schomburg shop in person. We'll put the link in the chat so you can get your hands on these exciting new works. So first, I'm going to bring up Dr. Matthew Delmont. He's the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College and author of Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. Next, we'll have Dr. Cookie Woolner, an Associate Professor of History at the University of Memphis, who will present on The Famous Lady Lovers, African American Women and Same-Sex Desire Before Stonewall. Next, we have Dr. Margaret Burnham, University Distinguished Professor of Law, Director of Reparations and Restorative Justice Initiatives, Director of Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern, who will share their work entitled By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Finally, we have Dr. Dylan Penningroth, a professor of law, and Alexander F. and May T. Morrison, professor of history at Berkeley Law School. He'll be in conversation on his book, Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Civil Rights. This is going to be an exciting conversation, so we can't wait to dive right on in.
So just diving right in, I think one of the things that we were so excited about tonight is really taking us to this period before Brown, to the 30s and 40s in particular. And I know when I was working on my Rosa Parks biography and the film, right, so many people treat the 30s and 40s as the prehistory when they're rushing ahead to get to the real history. And that really misses, I think, what the 30s and 40s do for the whole way of understanding what happens next. And so tonight, this is not the prehistory, this is the history. Robin.
Yeah, I often teach the first half of the 20th century from different frameworks in the courses that I teach. And I'm excited to bring together these questions, the question of queer desire, the family, the violence of everyday life and the resistance to that, military engagements, and to imagine battlefields at home and abroad to paint a more complicated picture of this much discussed and often misunderstood Jim Crow era. I'm particularly excited to invite the unexpected to the table, more intimate histories. What are the role of intimate histories in our understanding of the past? How can we understand stories of violence that sidestep victimhood and get us to the larger important questions of resistance? How do we understand warfare as a framework for the domestic and the global? And of course, underneath it all are the stories of ordinary people, freedom making, that complicate, that educate, and sometimes inspire us in these moments. So I can't wait to dive in. So Jean, let's move on to the first question.
So we'd like to begin by asking each of you, how did you come to this research? Sort of what experiences or questions, sort of personal, political, intellectual, brought you to this particular research topic? And Matt, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Jean, and thanks, Jean and Robin, for hosting us this evening. It's a real pleasure to be in the company of so many historians whose work I admire so greatly. And thanks everyone on YouTube for hanging with us through the tech issues. So this project, Half American, actually grew out of my last book project, which was a project called Black Quotidian: Everyday History in African American Newspapers. And so for that project, I was looking at papers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, New York Amsterdam News, to try to get a sense of how Black communities experienced different periods of history as they were unfolding. And what struck me with that was how much I learned in the course of doing the research. And I think on this first day of Black History Month, I think that's the thing that stands out to me, is the importance of curiosity, the importance of keep trying to learn more and more about this history. But particularly in terms of World War II, the thing that struck me was I kept coming across these pictures and stories about the more than 1 million Black men and women who served in the military during World War II. Now, obviously, I'm a teacher. I've taught about this topic in the classroom for more than a decade, but I'd never seen this many examples of average Black Americans in the service of the country. People from Minnesota, where I'm from, people from Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Alabama. It made me curious. I wanted to know what more there was to the story. And so that's what really sparked my curiosity and led to the research that resulted in Half American. And what I came to appreciate in the course of doing the research was how much the story changes when you look at the story from the Black perspective, when you move Black people to the center of the story. You get a whole new appreciation for the civil rights battles that were happening at home and how active those were in the war years. We also get a whole new appreciation of how vital Black Americans were to helping America and the Allies win the war, that America could not have won World War II without the contributions of Black troops. It also really challenges the chronology of the war. That for Black Americans, the war really starts before the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and it carries on past 1945. And so for me, I think what I took away from doing the research was how important curiosity was to try to learn more about a topic that you think you know well, and how important it is to treat the sources as the thing that guides the story that you're trying to tell, and really tell the story through the eyes and experiences and lives of Black Americans.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Jean. Thanks so much, Matthew. I feel like I really haven't met Matthew yet, but we have met. We have the same book year, so we've been together in many of these conversations. It's really great to be at the Schomburg, sitting here in my office in Boston, but it's great to be back at the Schomburg. And thank you so much, Jean and Robin. My book, My Hands Now Known, really came as a consequence of collecting cases of homicidal racial violence in the 30s and 40s, and thinking about the movements, both the radical and reformist movements that confronted these atrocities during that time, and what they meant for movement building, movement growing, and taking really a second look at both the nature of the violence, the nature of the response and resistance to the violence, and for me as a legal scholar, the role of the federal government. I came to the work in the wake of a initiative started by the federal government, of all places. Federal government passed a bill, an act called the Emmett Till Cold Case Act in 2007, which promised federal resources to examine cases, cold cases from the civil rights era. And so I began following that work, and I quickly realized that there was a whole series of events that would not be covered by the resources made available in the Emmett Till Act, but where families were still waiting for answers. And so the work was really driven by conversations that I began to have with families who had lost their loved ones to violence in the 1930s, 1940s, and who were, as it were, waiting for the call. And so with my students, we began to collect the cases, collect the evidence, share the evidence with families, find out what they knew about these cases, and return the cases to the communities from whence they had come. It's been extraordinarily rewarding work, heartbreaking work, but also exposes real holes in our research, in our work over as we think about and as we've looked at the years. Talk about the Harlem Renaissance. We talk about all kinds of, momentous developments in African American culture and history and resistance during that period of time. But there is this work that is left yet still incomplete.
Well, I'm just delighted to be here, also surrounded by such incredible historians. And thank you also to the Schomburg for welcoming us and the tech support team for sorting everything out. So you asked how I got interested in this work, and really for me, I think the best answer is that it came from hearing family stories. You go to enough cookouts, and if you hang out around the grill long enough, people will sometimes tell stories. And over the years, I remember one in particular that stood out. It was my great uncle, man named Jackson Holcomb, who was an enslaved person in Virginia, in Cumberland County. And around the end of the Civil War, apparently, the Confederate soldiers are fleeing through the woods, and they come to the riverside, and he has a boat. They ask for a ferry ride across the river. He takes them across, and when they get to the other side, they paid him. And I remember thinking, that's a very strange thing to do. These are white men fighting to preserve slavery. They have guns. They don't need to pay him, but they did. And so I started to wonder what that meant. It raised questions in my mind about a world where people who do not have rights, nevertheless, are able to collect on what essentially is something that looks and sounds like a contract. And so that's sort of the thing that got me going on this. And what I wound up with was a book that focuses on how African Americans from the 1830s through the 1970s thought about, talked about, and how they used law. And this, of course, is an era when we're traditionally taught that Black people are left outside the law. So it's a story about Black legal lives that tries to open a window on Black life itself. The one thing that it's important for me to say at the outset is that my book is not a story of the freedom struggle. It does, I think, shed new light on the freedom struggle, but the freedom struggle is not the driving story of this book. This book puts Black people at the center in a somewhat different way, in the sense that it is not focused primarily on race relations, but it does, along the way, I think, try to shed some light on how race worked in American law, often through cases that were not actually about race and often didn't even mention the race of the people involved. So if you look, for example, at a contracts casebook that a law student at Harvard Law or Berkeley Law might be using today, there are at least a handful of cases where one of the parties is Black or that feature racial language in the legal theory underpinning it, but the students will not know it because that information isn't there anymore. So I wanted to try and figure out not just how it disappeared, but also why and what that means for the world that we live in terms of law.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the invitation, Jean and Robin. I'm thrilled to be here. And my book would not exist without the Schomburg, where I actually did research. It's been over a decade now. So my book was my first book. So I kind of started a long time ago. I'm actually in San Francisco right now, where I've just celebrated my 50th birthday. And this pretty much started with work I first was inspired by in undergrad. So it's been a long journey. So my book is about the emergence of Black queer women's social worlds in the urban North and in the interwar era. So I'll be focusing more on the 30s today. And in this time, women who loved women were referred to as lady lovers. And so for me, this project really began with the classic blues women like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. And I'll also note that before I became a historian, I was a musician and a performer. So I've always been interested in the history of the arts and music and popular culture. So in the 90s, back when I did my undergrad thesis, it focused on representations of fat women, of which I am one myself. And this was the context in which I first learned about Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and their songs of unabashed desire, which really blew me away as a very young, insecure college student. And also in undergrad, I was inspired by works by folks like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Marlon Riggs, and many other Black queer radical thinkers who I've learned so much from. After that, I moved to San Francisco, basically to build a queer life in my 20s. And that's when I started learning about the scholarship of queer history, which inspired me eventually to get my PhD. This is also about the time I first read Angela Davis's incredible book, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, which is one of the works I'm very indebted to. So as I got more into learning about queer history, unsurprisingly, I learned that white people had generally been the focus of much of the work so far. And this is back in 2007. So of course, this has changed some since then. But I really wanted to kind of push back on the overwhelming whiteness of queer history at the time. And I recall that some of the blues women had had relationships with women. So the dissertation kind of came together through that angle. And originally it was just going to focus on the queer blues women in the entertainment industry. But then as I got into the archives, I kept coming across other sources about everyday Black women in newspaper articles, often in instances of kind of like alleged jealous violence between groups of women socializing together in the urban North. So the story became then much larger and more kind of about the emergence of Black queer women's social networks in the 20s and 30s.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's great to sort of have all of these conceptual frameworks in conversation with each other. I want to give the opportunity to teach us something. Give us a window into your work. Bring us into the world of the 30s and the 40s as you show it. What is the intervention your book is making into this era? And if you want to tell us a story as part of that, just feel free to go right on ahead. We'll start with you, Margaret.
So thanks so much, Robin. So actually, I do have a story to share. It's a story that I learned just a few hours ago. I actually taught a class today. I teach a clinic. I teach 16 students who work through the kinds of cases that I talk about in my book. And we've collected in our archive, we've collected 1,000 of those cases. So this is one of 1,000. It involved a man by the name of George Brooks, who was killed in Memphis in 1938, in January of 1938. Now, Mr. Brooks was a postal worker in the city of Memphis, and that was a job that was not held by very, very many Black people. And white people resented the introduction of Black postal workers. He was set up and framed by the Memphis Police Department, who accused him of socializing with a white woman. That was the charge, socializing with a white woman. And a white police officer who had previously killed 3 Black men cornered George Brooks and shot him to death. An investigation took place by the U.S. Postal Service with no results. There was no prosecution. There was no investigation into the behavior of this murderous police officer. And 2,000 people attended Mr. Brooks' funeral, organized at the time by the Memphis NAACP and other civil rights organizations in that town. That tells us so much, both about the 30s, about labor, about law, and about organized resistance as well as the the impetus of folks to gather in large numbers, as they did in this case. 2,000 people at what was both a funeral as well as a commemoration, as well as an event of solidarity. And so I discovered this story today. No, rather, let me say, my students discovered this story and related it in class today. They also said, and this I've not yet verified, that there is no secondary literature that tells the story of George Brooks, that his story was lost and all of its implications, all of what it has to say about Black resistance, organized and spontaneous, has been lost to history. And so iterate and reiterate times 1,000. And that's the nature of the work. And in lifting up these cases and reaching out to the family members and to the communities, what we hope is to give them the sense that this is part of their personal and family history, but more broadly and perhaps as significantly, to reconstruct African-American and indeed American history.
I'd like to tell a story too, and this one involves a much more famous person, a guy named Thurgood Marshall. You may remember the name. So Marshall, of course, is one of the lead architects of Brown versus Board of Education, the case that sets Jim Crow, at least in education, on the road to extinction. As we know, it's not extinct, but that's a different story. So 1973, Marshall sits down for an interview with a journalist named Richard Kluger. And Kluger asks Marshall a question that is pretty explosive. Marshall's team had decided during the Brown case that part of their argument was going to be that segregation should be ruled unconstitutional because it damaged Black children psychologically. It affected their self-esteem. In order to prove that, he brought in psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who presented evidence about a series of experiments they did involving dolls. They basically showed Black children dolls of different colors and asked them how they felt about those dolls, which one they would choose. That evidence went into Brown versus Board of Education, the opinion, as footnote 11. It's probably the second most famous footnote in constitutional history, and it was immediately controversial. It was sort of the Achilles heel in the minds of many legal experts. So Kluger asked Marshall, why did you choose to rely on social science evidence in a case like this that's so important? And Marshall's answer was really interesting. He said, I wasn't worried about this at all. I said to the team, we have to try this case just like any other case with damages. If your car ran over me, then you would have to pay up. Marshall here is talking like a tort lawyer. He's talking like an ambulance chasing lawyer, the kind that you see billboards up on the highway. This is sort of the kind of low rent, crass lawyering that we don't really associate with the freedom struggle or the fight against Brown. But it made perfect sense to Marshall. Why? Because he knew his audience, and his audience wasn't just the Supreme Court. It was African Americans who knew exactly what a tort case was, because they had 100 years of experience engaging with law in local courts. They had been suing one another, suing white people, not over what you would identify as race discrimination cases. They almost never had to do with that. They were simply things like broken contracts, divorce, property disputes, corporation disputes, things like that. What we're seeing in that little story where Marshall is talking to Kluger is a shift between two different concepts of civil rights. The first concept is what I call the rights of everyday use: property, contract, the right to sue and be sued. Those are actually the rights that are enshrined in the first Civil Rights Act that the United States ever passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And they're fundamental. They're defined by the states, not by the federal government. That's 1866. By 1954, when Marshall is trying Brown, the goal is to end race discrimination. That's what civil rights means by the 1950s. By the late 1960s, activists have pushed and made civil rights mean something different. It no longer has anything or much to do with rights. It's about human rights, if that, or something bigger, like a larger freedom of the human spirit. You think about those last two definitions, race discrimination, freedom of the human spirit, there's no room for Marshall's plaintiff in either one of those. There's no room for the humdrum understanding that Black people had developed since the 1830s about law. And yet and still, Brown and the activists like SNCC, SCLC, all those organizations that drove the street freedom struggle forward, they relied on Black people's legal knowledge, their legal capacities, and they relied on these rights of everyday use. Just to take a quick example, if you think about what SCLC was or SNCC, those were organizations. SNCC never incorporated, SCLC did. So did the Montgomery Improvement Association, and corporation law is one of the reasons why some of those organizations lasted and others did not. So this long and deep history of the rights of everyday use that are distinct from the claims of race discrimination, civil rights, that connection and that shift is sort of the backbone story of my book.
All right, so I'll tell a story too, but I'll set it up a little bit first. So my book reveals the way that Black women who loved women, who again were known as often lady lovers or women lovers in the early 20th century, the ways they boldly created lives that allowed them the freedom to nurture queer relationships long before the Stonewall uprising of 1969, which is often used to kind of mark the beginning of the modern gay era. Much of my book does focus on the 20s, but I'll focus on the 30s today to stay on topic. And I'm just going to give a couple examples of how women found each other and began to create these new subcultures before World War II. World War II is pretty much where my book ends. And of course, World War II is also another important era as lesbian and gay identities are emerging and communities are forming, and especially in coastal cities during the war. So I'm going to talk briefly about a woman named Mabel Hampton, who was a lady lover and a Southern migrant. She was born in North Carolina in 1902, and she moved to New York with her aunt as a young woman. She worked as a chorus girl in Greenwich Village, Harlem, also in Coney Island as well. And she supplemented her work as a chorus girl also as with doing domestic work, since being a chorus girl didn't necessarily pay enough money at the time. The entertainment world offered a very important alternative to domestic work for thousands of Black women at this time. But much of this work was low paying unless you became, a huge celebrity like Bessie Smith. So at this time, the world of Black vaudeville, musicals, and blues are creating spaces for Black performing women who love women to meet each other. They're meeting backstage, on the road, and house parties. And house parties where lady lovers really preferred to socialize for safety and for privacy. So by the time we get into the 1930s, of course, we've entered into the Great Depression. So money is harder to come by. And the rent party becomes this new phenomenon, kind of like a house party that was very, very popular. And many entrepreneurial women, especially in Harlem, threw rent parties. They involved charging guests a fee to get in, supplying food and drinks and entertainment. And the entrance fee was used to pay their rent. So it was really a type of mutual aid used to survive and to pool their resources in this challenging time of the economic downturn. And rent parties would be advertised with calling cards that hosts would hand out and affix to doorways to publicize the event. So one day in September 1932, while Mabel Hampton was waiting for the bus, a beautiful woman came up to her and gave her a rent party invitation, and they started chatting. And the rent party invitation read, "Hard times are here, but not to stay, so come and sing and dance your blues away at a Sunday matinee given by Lillian." And not only did Mabel Hampton attend Lillian's rent party, but the two women went on to become partners who lived together for over 40 years, mostly in Harlem. And Mabel Hampton later did oral histories for the Lesbian Herstory Archives over in Brooklyn about her experiences in the early 20th century queer world of Harlem. And these are very rare and important firsthand accounts of this queer world. So that's one example of the ways that women would meet at this time. And then another one also related to the Great Depression. So we also have in Harlem the beloved actress Edna Thomas. She lived in Harlem with her husband and also with her girlfriend, who was a British aristocrat. The three of them lived together during the Great Depression. And Thomas told her friends and also nosy, curious journalists that she and her husband merely took in a roommate to save money. So really economic survival kind of created these new opportunities for women to live with multiple partners, creating new forms of modern kinship, but they could kind of justify them due to economic circumstances. So I share these stories from my book to show how these circumstances of the Great Depression in the 30s created new openings for Black queer women to support each other and to find each other. And this is also against the backdrop of the Great Migration, which is bringing many single women to the North, and also Prohibition, which is creating these spaces where people can kind of gather and break social conventions together. So it's kind of the confluence of these different events that are creating the opportunity for Black lady lovers' lives to kind of emerge and their subcultures to flourish.
Those are great stories, Cookie. Thank you for sharing those. The one I'll share is, I mentioned earlier, Black newspapers. One of the things I came across in looking at the Pittsburgh Courier was a letter written in late December 1941 by a man named James G. Thompson. James Thompson was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, and he was thinking about what it would mean for him and other Black Americans to be drafted into a segregated military. The entire U.S. military was segregated throughout World War II. So he writes this letter to the Pittsburgh Courier that asks a series of very pressing and pointed questions. He asked in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, really stuck with me. It's why I chose Half American as the title of the book. What Thompson was doing, though, he's calling out the hypocrisy of the United States, claiming to be fighting a war for freedom and democracy with the segregated military. And I think it's an important reminder that it wasn't historians decades later that recognized this hypocrisy, recognized how unfair it was. It was palpable to Black Americans at the time. They called it out consistently that fighting this war with the segregated army while segregation, Jim Crow, was the order of the day in the United States was deeply unfair. The Pittsburgh Courier used Thompson's letter to launch the Double Victory Campaign. Double Victory Campaign stood for Black Americans fighting for victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism at home. It really became the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. I think it's important to understand it wasn't just a clever slogan or rhetorical device. It really was a two-front battle. This is how Black newspapers reported on it during the war. They were talking about the military battlefronts and how important it was to defeat the Nazis on those military battlefields, but also talking about how that wasn't enough. It wasn't just enough to defeat Hitler and the Nazis abroad if you had to come home to a very similar version of white supremacy here in the United States. And so it's important to understand those as parallel struggles. On the home front, one of the people I talk about in the book is Ella Baker, the famous grassroots activist. She obviously is well known for her work with SNCC, the Student Non-Black Coordinating Committee in the 1960s. But during World War II, she was the head of branch membership for the NAACP. So she's traveling all across the country, helping to organize local people to fight for their rights, holding leadership training workshops that prepared people to fight for civil rights and Black freedom in the decades after World War II. One of my favorite archival finds, historians love evidence, so I have to talk about one of my favorite pieces of evidence. It actually comes from the Schomburg. Among the many collections that the Schomburg has is Ella Baker's papers. And one of the letters that's there is a letter that was written by a unit, a Black unit that was stationed at Normandy, the site of the D-Day invasion, just months after the D-Day invasion. They were writing this letter back to Ella Baker, sending money. And what they said in the letter was, we value the Double Victory Campaign. We're doing everything we can here on the battlefield, but we know that's not enough. So here is, and this is literal, $336.78 for the NAACP to be fighting these legal cases back at home. And so I just have to picture these Black soldiers kind of literally passing the helmet around, getting all the money they could to fight the Double Victory Campaign. I think for me, that was the clearest articulation of what the Double Victory Campaign was about. Black Americans were absolutely committed to winning the war militarily, but they recognized that wasn't enough. And so they wanted to help finally defeat Jim Crow, finally defeat white supremacy in the United States, so there'd be actual freedom and democracy here in America.
Thank you. I love all these stories. So for our audience, we're getting closer to the part where you get to ask questions, so please start putting your questions in the chat. As Robin and I started this, one of the things we always try to do in conversations is to sort of use this history to think about the present, to think about the sort of Black freedom struggle more broadly. And I think part of what our conversation is doing tonight is taking us before the more storied parts of the Black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 70s. And saying the decades of the 1930s and 40s change how we see the 20th century, change how we see the United States, and change how we see the Black freedom struggle, both the forms it's taken, but also the forms that it can take going forward. And so for each of you, I think we would like to hear how your work kind of changes the way we understand the Black freedom struggle, both in the past, but also in the present. And let's start with you, Dylan.
I think I'll answer that question with yet another story. And this one also comes from the Schomburg. I was sitting in there a couple of years ago, and I came across a letter from a woman in Washington, D.C. named Vernita Wimbush. She's writing in July of 1966 to her bishop. And she starts the letter like this. Do you recall the March on Washington of August 1963? I think you urged all CME churches to try, if possible, to participate in that march so that we could fight for our rights. Wimbush is writing because the bishop has just removed the pastor of her church, and that she and the other members are not happy about this. So what she says is, we have gotten together, we the members of the church have gotten together, we're going to take your advice, and we're planning a march to your house on July 28th, 1966, because we're here to fight for our rights to keep our pastor. That is a fascinating document. It is not the first time that Black women have fought back against the prerogatives of male-led Black religious organizations, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But her letter raises some really interesting questions that I think are crucial for understanding African-American history in this period. What Vernita Wimbush is showing is that Black women were essentially fighting a two-front war. One was against white supremacy in society. That one I think we know about, and that is the one that we, for shorthand, call the Black freedom struggle. But they're also fighting a second war, and that's against male supremacy in church and in civil rights organizations. And that two-front struggle in both dimensions hinges on the following really difficult question. If you are a member of a church, or if you are a member of the NAACP or SNCC, do you have rights in the church? Or do you only have privileges? That is actually both a social question, it's also a legal question. It's a question that generated lawsuits going back to the 1790s, involving African-American organizations, including churches. And those lawsuits actually helped shape American law, the private law of religion. But those sorts of questions do not fit easily into the Black freedom struggle narrative. They're not about race relations. They're not about struggle against white people, although they are related. They're complementary. And so what I think is important for us is to foreground those kinds of stories and figure out how we can create a more holistic view of what Black life was like before the civil rights movement.
Thank you for that, Dylan. So historians of sexuality actually tend to view the early 20th century, like the 20s and 30s, as oftentimes more queer-friendly than the immediate post-war era, right? Because then we have this repressive rise of, the McCarthy era. We have a lot of anti-gay antagonism, which has come to be known really as the Lavender Scare, which we think about alongside the Red Scare. And this is an era in which we have significant Black gay figures like Bayard Rustin being arrested for having sex with men. Hundreds of gay and allegedly gay people are being fired from federal jobs. And more kind of relevant to my specific work, we have figures such as the once outrageous Prohibition era performer Gladys Bentley, who was a large masculine woman who wore men's clothes on and off stage, very bold to wear pants in the street at this time, before World War II for women. She's playing the piano all night long in Harlem speakeasy. She's flirting with all the women in her audience. She even goes as far as to marry her girlfriend in an Atlantic City ceremony. So that's in the, the Prohibition era. And then by the time we get to the early 1950s, right, this repressive McCarthyist era, she writes an article for Ebony magazine entitled "I Am a Woman Again," where she talks about how with the help of doctors and hormones, she is now feminine and heterosexual. She is no longer masculine. She's no longer queer. So just from this example, right, this example of the shift of someone being very outright and openly queer in the 30s and then kind of going back into the closet in the 50s in the McCarthy era, we can see this example, as we can see again today, sadly, the ways that, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality, progress and acceptance, they don't just move on this slow upward trajectory. We have these moments of progress and these moments of backlash. And so of course, in the post-World War II era, we do see Black queer communities continuing to grow. And we actually see a lot of coverage of drag balls in Ebony and Jet at this time, for example. But of course, by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, we see the emergence of Black lesbian feminist cultures and communities. And I would really argue in some ways they have more kind of commonalities with the world I'm writing about in the 20s and 30s than what's going on kind of in this deeply conservative 50s era. And then also I just want to note, I mentioned in the published interview that went along with our roundtable that not only folks like Bayard Rustin are involved in these mid-century Black queer literary circles and theatrical circles, but we also have people, very important figures like Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray, for example, there was a short-lived literary journal called New Challenge, which was published by the Lady Lovers, Dorothy West and Marion Minus. They were a couple. I write about them in the book, and this journal featured many other Black queer writers, including Murray. So we can really kind of see these pre-1954 Black queer literary and theatrical circles kind of bolstering the movement to come.
Thanks, Cookie. I think one of the through lines I would highlight is just the importance of everyday people organizing to fight for their rights. I mean, it's been one of the through lines throughout African American history. In the World War II time period, I think we often talk about World War II as being a turning point in terms of Black freedom struggles and civil rights. And I think part of what we mean by that is the infrastructure of organizing gets built out during the course of the war. Think about in the immediate months before World War II, A. Philip Randolph threatens to lead the March on Washington. You have this March on Washington movement get created all over the country with chapters all over the United States. I mentioned Ella Baker earlier. If you look at the membership for the NAACP and the number of chapters, it balloons over the course of the war. Part of what that means is the NAACP has more dues-paying members, so they have more resources to fight larger and more complex civil rights cases. But it also means that you have local people who have the capacity, have the organizing skill and leadership to be able to fight for the issues that matter in their communities, whether it's school segregation, voting rights, employment discrimination, housing discrimination. They're not waiting for an iconic leader to come along and lead them. They are their own leaders. So it's a leader-full movement, as Ella Baker would say. The other thing I would highlight is how much resistance there was in the immediate years after World War II. I think it's nice to think that World War II is somehow a more unified time period in American history, but when you look at the evidence, it absolutely was not. One of the things I argue in the book is if Black Americans were fighting a double victory campaign, most white Americans were fighting a single victory campaign. They wanted to win the war and then go back to the status quo. This shows up in the polling data at the time and in the actual behavior and resistance that too many white communities showed to integration in neighborhoods or in schools. And so that's what Black veterans came back to in 1945. As one veteran put it, they went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. And so I think troubling that idea that America opened its arms to civil rights and to democracy. America wasn't a functioning democracy in 1945. Right? Black people in the South couldn't vote. Someone like James O. Eastland wouldn't have been in the Senate from Mississippi if Black people in Mississippi could vote. And so I think part of looking back at that time period forces us to recognize every month, every week was a struggle to fight for the rights that Black Americans and all Americans deserved.
Thanks so much, Matthew. I guess what I would add is that, as we look at the 1930s and 1940s, both the continuities, but also the disjunctures, what I would add to what Matthew says is that an important disjuncture is the introduction of McCarthyism in the late 1940s and its effect on the movements that had been built up over the 1930s and the 1940s. Now, I'm not talking from perspective of a family member here because I'm an academic and I look at history in an objective fashion, but I will say that much of my interest in the 1940s does stem from the fact that my father and my mother participated in the 1940s in the Southern Negro Youth Congress. The papers of that organization are at the Schomburg, and they are rich with evidence of efforts on the part of the Southern Negro Youth Congress and other organizations of that period to engage with many of the issues that we are obviously still working on today. So, on the question of how we can imagine deracialized futurity and what the past tells us about how to get there, I'd say the work is really yet to be done. Obviously, the connections are, well known, and well recognized, well known. But the spaces between the past and the present, how these legacies get carried over from one era, from one generation, from one period to the next. I think that we don't really have the theoretical or the empirical underpinnings fully to understand the ways in which the past that where we work are connected with the social realities that we face today. Obviously, the legacies of racial violence, as we all know, obviously evidence themselves in the ongoing racial atrocities of today. But exactly how these things repeat, why the South is still so much different from other parts of the country, why Mississippi is so different from, say, Texas or Florida in terms of its racial dynamics, racial culture, and the subordination of its racial minorities. That we really, I think, is work that is really left yet to be done. And in part, it's done by the unearthing of the history that we've talked about today. So historians certainly have a role here, but it really reaches beyond history. It's a job as well for sociologists, anthropologists, and others who can work together to kind of knit together the ways in which these phenomena are related and inherited.
Thanks so much, Margaret. The audience is with us. It's full of movement veterans, ordinary people from all over the country and even internationally. I have to shout out Barbara Smith, who I saw making comments in the chat, formidable activist, scholar, thinker, theorist. Barbara Smith is with us, as well as others. So I want to highlight and tell everyone that you are important to us, and to put yourself into the chat and into history to ask our speakers questions. So we have a question from Perry Diggs, who's been with us. The question is, African-American soldiers have fought in every war and conflict that the U.S. has been involved in. How would you explain their patriotism despite the realities of oppression and inequality at home? So anyone could take that, but especially Matthew.
I think it's a great question. It's one of the things that was so frustrating for Black Americans during World War II is that the military did everything they could to disparage the service of Black Americans, disparage their patriotism. They turned away people after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There are Black recruits trying to volunteer for the Army and the Navy who were being turned away in those weeks after Pearl Harbor. The Army is arguing that Black Americans don't have the intelligence and courage and bravery to serve in combat. And for Black people, they're pointing to the fact that Black Americans have fought in every single war the United States has ever been a part of. I think for me, part of what I came away from doing the research thinking and realizing was for Black Americans, patriotism and dissent have always been intertwined. I'm reading a book right now by Joanne Reed on Medgar Evers and Murray Evers. And one of the things she writes about there is how Murray Evers described Medgar as saying he loved America, but he wasn't sure that America loved him back. Right? And I think that's what Black Americans have long felt, right? That there is a sense of desire to see America be a better country, but a reality that America hasn't repaid the debt that Black Americans have given to it. And so I think for the World War II generation, certainly, part of what comes through in looking at the experiences of those Black men and women who served in the military is the majority consider themselves to be patriotic, but they also recognize that they couldn't just fight for America during the war. They had to keep fighting for America after the war. So that's where the dissent came in, that their version of patriotism was a critical patriotism. It wasn't just about loving the country blindly, but it's about loving the country so much that you were going to fight to change it, to make it an actual democracy.
Thank you. We have a question from James Sullivan, again, bringing us back to kind of our home audience, both thinking about sort of Adam Clayton Powell, and particularly Adam Clayton Powell in the 30s and 40s, right, which is before he becomes Congressman Powell, right, who might want to speak to kind of his work in the 30s and 40s, and also kind of what's happening in Harlem in specific in this era. And I think any of you could take that. Obviously, maybe Cookie, you want to start, since you've already brought us to Harlem in the 1930s, but hopefully others as well.
Yes, well, I'm actually familiar with, it's actually bordering on the 30s, 1929. There is an infamous article by him in the Black press kind of talking about the problem of queerness within the Black church and the Black community in Harlem. And it's really one of the first kind of, anti-gay sermons that we're familiar with. And he specifically is referring to women kind of calling out, older women who are trying to kind of seduce younger women. So it's kind of, this key example of the ways that issues of religion and respectability are kind of coming to the fore, right? Even for the queer women who are, involved in intellectual work and in cultural work, there's really no way that they can kind of be seen as role models or respectable in this moment, right? This very still anti-queer moment. I mean, this is a moment still, within the world of medicine and sexology where, queerness is referred to as pathological, as unnatural. And then this type of language is also being used in the Black press to kind of denigrate queer women as well. So, unfortunately, the discourse that comes out of his sermon in 1929 is seen as kind of the beginning of this type of rhetoric, which, of course, many women are still pushing back against, and they're still, going about their lives and finding one another despite it.
Any other comments on Harlem or Powell? When you get in there,
I was just going to comment on, just to sort of surface the significance that I see in what Cookie's doing here, that there is this, or there was this perception that Black communities are monolithically homophobic and always have been. I think that perception was kind of popularized, especially when California did its Prop 8 campaign, but, you're showing us that there's a history behind this, that there are specific people who are preaching sermons that are homophobic. And at the same time, there's also this vibrant culture that you can find in the pages of Ebony and Jet magazines, where they're talking about drag balls. It's just amazing. And I think it's just really important for us to think about the complexity of these stories and not view an entire people as one thing or another.
And I'll also just add that, of course, the largest force here is white supremacy, right? I mean, that's what's kind of, leading to the pressure about respectability, about not appearing queer in public, about concern as the North is becoming more racially diverse with the Great Migration, right? So I really think it's the overarching white supremacy that's seen as is really the key issue here, right? And like, it's important to get away from this, this ongoing long-standing stereotype that the Black community is more homophobic than the white community, right? I mean, the overarching issue is white supremacy. So I just wanted to bring that up too.
Thank you. Wanted to ask everyone a question, the same question. Maybe you could just answer it in a quick succession. But talk to us about your book titles, right? Oftentimes authors go through so much with the book titles. The final title may not have been your title, but now here it is. And I think the words before the colon have been so interesting and intriguing, from famous lady lovers to half American to hands now known to before Brown. So talk to us about just naming your work and what the reader can take away when they see that on the cover. Margaret, do you want to start us off? I think you're muted still.
Yes, I'm happy to start. So thanks so much. Thanks for the question. By hands now known is a reference to a common description of lynchings and other forms of homicidal racial violence used by legal officials, and the expression is by hands unknown, intended to suggest that although these events were widely known, whether they were spectacular lynchings with thousands of people, including children and picnic baskets, or whether they were events that took place in police stations before 3 or 4 prisoners and police officers. Everyone in town knew who committed the crimes. And yet the coroner or the prosecutor would conclude the legal proceedings quickly after the event by describing them as unknown, by describing the perpetrators as invisible, unknown, undiscoverable, end of story. And so what I try to suggest here is that we do know, actually, not just the actors, not just the perpetrators, but we know the systemic and historic causes of the violence that was so thoroughgoing, so random, so humdrum, so quotidian, and that characterized, infected and flooded Black life, and also generated the kind of resistance movements that have that led us into the 1960s, and that Matthew and I both write about in our books. So I'm suggesting that we know, but we don't know enough. And so this notion that this could remain invisible and undiscoverable forever, I hope to dismantle by inviting people to know more.
Who's next?
Maybe I'll chime in. So my book is called Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Black Civil Rights. And when I say that it was a hidden history, what I mean is partly that the sources are hard to get at. Some of the sources I use are traditional legal sources that you can find, reported cases like on Westlaw. I used newspapers, diaries, but the main source that I used was trial records from county courthouses. So what I did is I went to about 24 county courthouses in 4 states in the District of Columbia. I would hop in the car or I'd get on a plane and I'd fly down to Holly Springs, Mississippi, and I'd go down to Court Square and I'd walk up and I'd ask the circuit clerk, can I see these documents? And of course, I called ahead. And if they allowed me to see them, I would go in and I would bring down these big, heavy ledger books. And I would look for cases, and I would take a sample of cases. The thing that you discover very quickly when you're doing this kind of research is that the cases are not marked by race. So you can go through 150 docket books, 200,000 cases, and you won't see a single case that indicates what race the parties involved were. So that kind of creates a problem right there. Like, here I am, I want to write a book about African-American history, and I can't tell who's Black. And so I found a way to do it. It involved looking all of them up on Ancestry.com. You know, they're more than the cheek swabs that you can actually look up people in the census. But what that told me is that there's this whole history of African Americans that's essentially hiding in plain sight right down the street at your county courthouse. And that history is not about race relations. It's not about primarily fighting against white supremacy. And that's because the kinds of cases that you can hear in a county court, they don't include race discrimination. That's not the kind of case you can bring there. What instead they're about inheritance, right? Like somebody's getting old, mom's getting old, dad's getting old. Who's going to take care of them? People fight about that. They fight now and they fought then. Those kinds of stories are heart-wrenching, they're human, and they're every bit as important to our shared history as the ones that we're more familiar with. So that's what I mean by the hidden history of Black civil rights.
All right, so my book's title is The Famous Lady Lovers, Black Women and Queer Desire Before Stonewall. I think this is a good exercise of me remembering I need to update my website because I think that title on there is still the earlier dissertation title. It's shifted a little bit. So the beginning part, The Famous Lady Lovers, that's actually a quote that comes from a Josephine Baker biography. It's a quote from an interview from a bisexual Black performing woman of the early 20th century named Maud Russell, and she referred to women like her and other women in the entertainment industry as the famous lady lovers. And she actually goes on to say, today you'd probably refer to us as bisexual. And then she goes on to even interestingly note that she said that oftentimes women had relationships with other women in the entertainment industry because men didn't treat them well, or the other men in the industry were also interested in men. So she kind of almost made it sound like it was, maybe not even her first choice, but kind of felt like, a second option, which is a little bit interesting. But I was just very struck by this, and I'd already heard about the term lady lovers before. So it's not, we see the term lesbian begins to emerge in the 1920s, but very few women identify with that term really until the mid or even the late 20th century, I would argue, at least for the first half of the 20th century, it's not too common. But another reason I love the term the lady lovers specifically is just that the fact that the word lady, right, has been reserved for elite white women. Ladyhood has been, historically in white supremacy seen as something that women of color and poor women, aren't of. So I love the way the lady lovers both kind of highlights their love, and especially because also the book, the first chapter focuses often on violent representations of them in the media and in the Black press. So the way the term kind of highlights, their ladyhood and their humanity and their love for one another, even though the larger community is often kind of viewing them as violent. And then I've also, it was hard to decide whether or not I want to use the term queer. Since the 90s, it's been used as kind of like an expansive umbrella term in queer work. And we do have a few sources of women referring to themselves as queer in the 1930s. I found some sources in Chicago, but I just often use it more as kind of an expansive term. But yeah, I have a whole section kind of on, the terminology I chose. Just figuring out which terms to use was definitely challenging because I always aspire to use the terms people use at the time.
It's hard picking a title, right? Like when you write a book, it's hard to hone in on just one thing. So I mentioned earlier, Half American comes from the letter that James Thompson wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier, which he said, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" And I think the reason that stuck with me is because I think he so accurately captured it. It was just unfair, right? To have these Black Americans be drafted into a military that was racially segregated, to be asked to fight for, potentially die for a country that was going to treat you as a second-class citizen. Just that one phrase, half American, summed up, I think, so much of what the book was about, what the Double Victory campaign was about. And then I can't speak for my colleagues, but I was angry writing this book. Right? If you think about what we've lived through in the last 10 years, much of my book wrote in the summer of 2020, I was frustrated that the country hasn't managed to be able to figure these things out, right? So many of the things that I'm writing about in 1945, 46 were playing out in the summer of 2020, that these same issues in terms of police brutality, in terms of voting rights, in terms of racial inequality and the racial wealth gap, all those things have their roots in this time period. And the part of the reason they're still with us today is that people weren't brave enough to take the actions to make them stop in that time period. And so I think for me, Half American also subtly, maybe not so subtly, tried to convey that sense of frustration, anger, and urgency that I took from the World War II time period, and I hope to bring in the present.
Awesome. So we're an audience of historians here at the Schomburg, and I think we love to hear about sources. And so in quick fashion, can each of you tell us one of your favorite finds that, for the book? Just like one great source, one surprising source, one
Oral
source.
interview or something, if you did oral interviews.
Exactly.
An unexpected audio that came your way.
So I'll go first, and I'll say, first of all, that, I didn't realize how many documents would emerge in my search that had not been surfaced by previous researchers. We've all had that experience. My most dramatic find was at NARA in College Park when I was looking at the murders of African-American soldiers during World War II. And I found a file called the Negro Transportation File, which recorded all of the efforts of the U.S. Army, the War Department at the time, to keep track of incidents where African Americans traveling across the country were abused or arrested or assaulted in some way, not so that they could provide remedies for African Americans who had to travel in these very dangerous ways, but really so that they could tamp down on any resistance that might arise on account of what happened to, say, for example, Jackie Robinson as he traveled across the country, and we all know the stories, Booker, Spicely, and others who were challenging Jim Crow and trying to get to their destination and trying to be good soldiers, and so this file crosses, across 4 or 5 states, and it's got all this detail that tells not just the story of the soldiers, but as well of ordinary African-American commuters who were trying to get from one place to another, and trying to also navigate Jim Crow. And the stories of the women in this file, because the Army required its folks to make these reports. So the stories of the women in these files really reveal, just a sense of the courage and force, as they asserted their bodies, their reality, their humanity in these bus incidents. That was my best find, and it's available. And I don't know that anyone else has found it. Matthew, did you find it?
I did not. I think that's the thing I love most about being in conversation with other historians and reading other people's books, right? It's all generative. It's all meant to be building on each other and in collaboration. I think the thing I shared earlier, the Ella Baker letter from Normandy. The other thing I would share is, I think most people are familiar with the name Doris Miller, the heroic mess attendant from the Battle of Pearl Harbor, maybe the best known Black American to serve in World War II. One of the things I didn't realize was how many Black mess attendants were there at Pearl Harbor. There were dozens of Black mess attendants on these different ships. And so my favorite find was an article about a young man named Julius Ellsbury, who was a 20-year-old mess attendant on the USS Oklahoma, who, like Miller, performed heroically on the morning of Pearl Harbor, but unlike Miller, actually lost his life in that battle. And the article was in a newspaper, had Julius Ellsbury's picture with the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," written in the corner of it. And that picture of him was posted everywhere in Birmingham, Alabama, in Black businesses and homes, because he was the first person, Black or white, to be killed from Birmingham, Alabama. And so, and for me, it just reminded me again, even when you know a subject really well, there's still so much you can learn. You learn so much in the course of doing this kind of research. And trying to put myself back in the shoes or the minds of someone in early 1942, those were the names that Black Americans were talking about. They're talking about Doris Miller, but they're talking about Julius Ellsbury and these local people who lost their lives, again, serving in these unequal situations.
Okay, I can go. So one of my very favorite sources that I worked with is actually a very large sexology book called Sex Variants, put together by a doctor named George Henry. And so there's like kind of hundreds of case interviews with queer people, Black and white people in the 1930s. It came out in 1940. And there was a woman, a lesbian who went by the pseudonym of Jan Gay, who was very tapped into the queer worlds of New York and San Francisco, and she knew all these queer women to interview. And so they have all these long interviews where it's hard to know, as a historian, if they're accurate or if some of the people are kind of saying what they thought the doctors wanted to hear. But it's this amazing way to kind of access firsthand accounts of queer Black people in the 1930s, and several of them are performers. And I just wanted to, one of them I quote from briefly in my conclusion. There was a 26-year-old woman named Susan who was involved in the arts community, and she had a girlfriend. She had basically had to leave her biological family to be with her girlfriend. But she told the interviewers in Sex Variants, so she said, regarding men, I'm not afraid of a man, but I have no desire, and I can see no reason why I should waste my time doing things I don't care about. She then declared, if I was born again, I would like to be just as I am. I'm perfectly satisfied being a girl and being as I am. I've never had any regrets. And so that's a Black queer woman from the 1930s, talking about her desires and her pride in being queer. And that's one of my favorite sources.
I think one of the sources that has stuck with me for a long time is a divorce case from 1886, Washington, D.C., where a minister named Edward Freeman sues his wife, Lucy Freeman, for divorce, and she never responds. He brings a bunch of male witnesses who talk a lot of smack about her and say she was loose and had borders and so forth. She never said a word. But there's one place in the file where her voice comes through, and that's a letter that he puts into evidence. And it goes like this: Mr. Freeman, I received your letter today and was glad to hear that you were speaking of a divorce. I never mean to live with you again as long as I live, so you have just as well get a divorce. And I expect to go to heaven without living with you. And if you don't, it's time you's praying. And I am perfectly willing for a divorce and have been willing for 7 years. It's true the winter been very hard, but still I did not notice it, only when I went outdoors. You needn't write here again, for I won't answer them and would not answer this if it were not for a divorce. This is all I have to say, Lucy Freeman. Why didn't she answer? It's because she knew that divorce cases required fault, and if she answered his petition, she would have to employ a lot of harsh language, possibly racist stereotypes, in order to succeed in winning, quote unquote, what both of them clearly wanted. So that's a source that sticks with me for years.
That's powerful, and I appreciate the close read there. Definitely, history can be so evocative and just entertaining. We can say it's not boring, although oftentimes people do suggest that our profession is such, but they don't know. We're actually having a ton of fun, going through a lot of emotions as we sort of journey through the past. We want to thank everyone for attending tonight's program, especially our speakers. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us through the technical difficulties. We want to remind you that we will be back on Thursday, March 7th, always the first Thursday of the month. We'll be in the building at the Schomburg in Harlem, so meet us there. The topic will be Black women, freedom making, and the long 1960s. We'll be in person at the Schomburg Center. There'll also be live stream capacity as well. And the speakers will be Anastasia Kerwood, Suzanne Cope, Tamika Brown-Nagin, and Christina Green, wonderful scholars who will bring the question of Black women freedom making in the long 1960s to you. Thank you so much, everyone who's worked so hard to make tonight a success in front of the cameras as well as behind the scenes. Thank you.